Welcome to the Truth, Lies, and Consequences podcast. I'm your host, Ebony Turner.
And I'm your host, Charity Hill. In this episode, we will be discussing the 4 principles of self-discovery, but within relationships. The 4 principles are spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical. And in this episode, we're going to go through each one individually and discuss how each impact relationships and what are the things we need to look for.
So in the last episode, we talked about our spiritual journey. We talked about, as an individual, how important it is to have that foundation spiritually. And as we think about that from a relationship standpoint, and if you're in a relationship with someone who doesn't have the same belief system that you have or faith that you have, that could be a real issue. So when I think about like the spiritual aspect, is because it helps us to know whether or not in a relationship, that person either is on one accord with us or not. First, you got to know where you stand and the importance of that spiritual for you, and then how it relates to the relationship. You can quickly, I guess, be able to know whether or not the person you're in a relationship with is probably compatible with you or they're a good fit for you to continue pursuing that relationship if you know where they stand spiritually. So that's the first thing that comes to mind for me when I think about spirituality and relationships. And then the next thing I think is around, I guess, for spiritually, I think that's where your moral compass comes from, right? So that's where your right and wrong, that's kind of your guide for life and your life rules and the things that you will and won't do. So whatever their moral compass is, I think is rooted in their spirituality or their spiritual walk. So if a person doesn't have that, then my concern will be, well, what's your moral compass? What's your indicator of what's right and what's wrong? How do you govern your life? And for me, I govern my life because of my faith as a Christian. And so I think that that's another thing that makes it important, is because that's where you get that's where a person's moral compass comes from. I don't know like if you'd agree to that, but that's kind of, for me, one of the 2 biggest things about how the spirituality impacts a relationship. So Cherry, tell me from your perspective, how is spirituality, as you go from the individual to the relationship, what are your thoughts about that?
Girl, I don't mess with you that don't know Jesus. That's me. It depends on the person. But from my experience and from being a Christian, I go to the scripture and they say, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. So if I already know my belief system is aligned with Christ and your belief system is aligned with not Christ, we're not going to make it. Now, I'm not saying faith walk has to be on the same maturity level, in the sense of, if I've been saved for X amount of years and you've been saved for X amount of months, I'm not saying that because you've only been saved for that amount of time, you couldn't be in a relationship with me. I'm not saying that. But I'm not saying if you have been a Christian for X amount of years, but your faith walk doesn't reflect that, that doesn't mean, that I'm gonna look at you better either. You have to get to know the person individually to know where their true mindset is when it pertains to how they view their relationship with Christ and God, and how those things are important and where they line up in their life. So, because I feel that if you're not agreed in your spiritual thought processes, and how we have said in the previous episode, how the spiritual tends to be the baseline for all the other levels and decisions that we make in our lives.
Right. If
we're already now on the same page, how are we going to be able to move forward? It goes back to, I looked up the scripture, Amos 3:3. How can 2 walk together unless they agree? We are not going to walk very far if we don't even agree on the bare minimum. So I definitely think that's important. I think people need to go ahead and quit playing with that, oh, well, he's cute and out, he kind of believes in some different stuff, but no, girl, no, don't play with that. Because you're going to develop feelings for this guy and then you pursue a relationship and it goes down the road, and then you want to marry him, but he don't even want to get married at the church that you have. That's where you go. Like if y'all are already on way different pages, you're playing yourself.
Yeah, so, that makes sense, right? You got to be on, because it's harder to walk away from a relationship that you're already into than it is at the beginning. So at the front end, when you're asking the right questions and then paying attention to their behavior. So because sometimes you can get a dude who will tell you that, yes, I am a Christian, yes, I am a believer, and they might go to church and do all of the things that on the surface of it, they could actually make it seem like y'all are on the same page and y'all are both believers. So there's sometimes where you have a person who will be upfront with you and say, yeah, I don't really do the church stuff, I don't do the Christian stuff, I'm kind of like a free soul, or whatever people come up with and say. But at the end of the day, I think it is a little bit hard out here when you think about dating, because people adapt, right? So I think that sometimes there are men who will adapt, not all men, some men who will adapt, and they will see that, oh, well, if your faith and your spiritual walk is important to you and being a Christian is important to you, it may not actually be as easy to tell whether that person's a Christian or not, or whether you and that person share the same faith or not. So I think that's why it's important to look at their actions and just kind of give time to verify, does their actions correspond with the stuff that they're saying?
Exactly.
And making sure you give enough time in a relationship and not moving too fast, because like you said, that point about how the guy will tell you maybe, and sometimes, well, I don't believe what you believe, but I do think we already almost decide that the guy's the right guy for us. And we're already almost down the aisle with him already. Like, we've already made the wedding plans in our head, because all right, this guy will work. I could spruce him up a little bit and make it work. So even though that's a big red flag, because he's telling you, I don't believe what you believe, we kind of push past that and say, well, eventually maybe he'll come around. Maybe I could convince him to believe what I believe. Like, I think that's where we get in trouble. So it's two pieces where on one hand, they might not be upfront with you, but on the other hand, I think they may be upfront with you, but you're already so like decided that this is the one for you that you might not even pay attention to them telling you that they're not on the same page. So the key is really slowing down a little bit and taking your time and not jumping too quickly, and then just paying attention to what you see and what you hear and making sure they match up together. You know what I mean?
Yes. And usually what a person feels spiritually is pretty established. It's not saying things can't change. God can change anybody. But Absolutely. 9 times out of 10, where they come in is where they are. So it's going to get better. Either they have something that, that's you can work with, or they have nothing. And you're just going to be like, well, unfortunately, this doesn't match for me. Or at least that's where I am. Different people, they feel that that's a area where they can be more lenient. I don't think that's a good idea. I think that you should know where you stand pertaining to that, because it's such a critical part of your life and the other individual's life. For example, I'm a preacher's kid. I've been going to church since day uno, literally. So going to church and being a part of a local body and participating in church and functions and stuff like that, that's always been very important to me. When I met my husband, that was not the case. He was so just a tender. He grew up he grew up as Catholic, which is not, grew up more in a Baptist background, which is still, both are Christians. So
they all got the same core belief.
Yes. Different denominations, different approaches.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
I got you.
The core of it is the same.
Exactly.
So I'm like, okay, even in that, he wasn't like an extremely active Catholic. So I was like, okay, gotcha. So how does that look for you? So it took me being around him and spending time with him and asking those questions to see where was his thoughts pertaining to, his faith and how important those things were. And it wasn't necessarily that it had to be Catholicism. It was more so it had to be about Christ. And once I understood that, and that was clear, then I was able to feel more confident in proceeding forward. But if that wasn't clear, if he was more about the Catholicism than Christ, then that probably would have been a red flag for me to not proceed forward. Not saying anything against him as a person. He'd be the same person. But for my faith walk, that wasn't going to line up for me. Yep. It's just a matter of knowing yourself enough to then be able to see other individuals and knowing if that's going to work or not. So that's part of, knowing how you feel and assuring yourself makes a huge difference of how it's going to affect your relationships.
Right. But I guess with that though, right, he says, like you or anyone in a relationship where they say that as long as Christ is the center of it all, we good. But at some point you have to look at how he lives his life too, though, because if he's telling you that this is what he believes, but his lifestyle is very different, even though he told you that this was what it is, I think, would you agree that, or how would it could have been different if his actions or anybody's actions are different from what they say they believe? That still would be a red flag as well, where you could still say,
it was a red with him. It was because even though he said that, and I'm like, okay, cool, but I don't ever see you going to mass. So those things weren't, at the time I met him. So, and I'm like, okay, that's fine. That's what your belief system is. But is that important to you? Because I want to see the fruit of that.
You said it right there, the fruit of what you believe. And how do you demonstrate that belief? Because saying something and actually demonstrating or doing it are two different things. So just because they say it doesn't mean the red flag goes away. It's about them saying it, but them doing it. And then getting to a point where they might start doing it because they want to keep you around.
Well, that's what happened. Because I'm like, I'm going to church. Do you want to come with me? Like, it's not a Catholic church, but they still preaching about Jesus. You say that's not an issue. So whosoever may come. So we would start going together. Now, true, the church I was going to, he didn't care for the style of. So I was okay. Well, this is further. And also, I'm not talking about this as we just met. This is like we've been together for years now. So we are at a point now where we're like, okay, is this really somebody I want to see myself building a future with at this point? You still want to be here with me. Okay, these are the things I need for you to be with me. And then are you willing to find some place or compromise on where we can both be comfortable and find something that will work for both of us. So I went to a church where he liked it more so. And I liked it too. It was different, but it was more of a mesh of what I enjoyed in church and what he enjoyed in church. He liked more teaching style of sermons, which I didn't have anything against. It just wasn't what I grew up listening to. So I was like, okay, if you like this church, I like this church. Let's keep going to this church and seeing if this is a church for both of us to still be able to worship God together. And we both can grow at this location. And that's the church we go to this day. Yeah. It worked for us, but I'm not saying for everybody that could necessarily be the case. It's just a matter of, if it's a Catholic church, it probably wouldn't have been the case. Just because there's some things in the Catholic faith I don't necessarily agree with, but that's just because of my, personal convictions. But both of us were willing to let go of just tradition and able to find a place that we both felt the Lord was leading us to be able to worship together, because we knew that was important.
That's real good. You did that before you guys got married.
Yes.
And so that provided enough time for you to see, was it going to stick, right? But just again, back to the time, given enough time to see, okay, he really, even though he wasn't going to church before I suggested it, when I'm suggesting we go to church and we're trying to work together to figure it out, it's a part of him and it's a core part of who he is and not just something he's putting on a facade to be, right?
Right, or just doing it because I asked.
Just doing it because he asked. So a lot of this goes back to like listening to the words, looking at the actions, and then giving time to verify that those actions are going to be consistent, but being on one accord, like you said, from a biblical perspective and just from a just when you think of hard times or going through stuff together, like you both have your faith that you can lean on, and you both are together leaning on the same thing versus, maybe one of you guys are leaning on alcohol or leaning on something different and another person's leaning on their faith. So I think there's a lot that helps when you have two people on one accord. And so the spiritual piece of it, man, is it could make or break a relationship, and I think can be a real deal breaker. Like from
it should be a deal breaker if you're not on one accord, because if you believe in biblical order, it's God, then it's the man who's the head of his household, and then you come under that. And then if you have children, right, they come under you. So if you believe in biblical order, you need to have someone that is going to bring their leadership under God's leadership. And then you have to be able to trust God to lead him, and he listens to God if you're trying to live a life that's aligned with the Bible. But if you already are interacting with somebody and they don't even follow suit to who Jesus is, and you're a Christian, or if you're of a different faith and they don't connect with that, you're already making it harder for yourself. Not saying it's impossible, but
it's a little harder.
In a situation that can be quite difficult.
Yeah. Now, because there may be some listeners who might be in a relationship with someone that has everything else they connect with, they click with, compatible with, but there is a difference in maybe the religious beliefs or religious background. So even in those relationships, if your beliefs are different, like you said, it does present an extra challenge. Mm-hmm. But if both of you respect, because those relationships, they can work, there has to be a level of respect for each person's belief systems. So I think there's a way that you could have two people with two different religious beliefs that maybe do it differently. Like you talked about, their traditions of how they demonstrate their faith is different, and be able to be together. But it really boils down to respecting each other. And as long as those core beliefs don't downright just conflict each other, well, one religion says it's okay to cheat and lie, steal, and do everything else, and the other religion, their core principles are something different. I think so. That's my thought on it, where it's I think you can still have a relationship with someone and it work if you guys have different religions or traditional religious beliefs, but it takes more work, especially when you bring kids into the equation, because now you have to figure out, okay, how do you navigate through your kid and which belief system they're going to go with. But there are people out there who are in relationships that do have a difference, and as long as you respect each other, and as long as this doesn't completely contrast, I think that could also work as well.
I hear what you're saying, but I don't agree. But I'm gonna explain why. The reason why is because, like you said, it comes down to the kids. When kids come into the picture, people naturally want their children to do what their faith is. I think it's the difference between religious and denomination. If you are of the same religion background, but the denomination is different, versus Lutheran and Catholic or Baptist or Methodist, those kind of things, they're of the same religion but of different denomination, where the basis of their beliefs are the same. It's just the traditions in which they go about those beliefs are different, whether they baptize full submersion or whether they sprinkle themselves and call that baptism. That's where the differences are. But when you're talking about completely different religions, when you're discussing more so Islam or Jehovah's Witness or Latter-day Saints, those are completely different religions. So those faiths would not necessarily mesh well with an individual who would be of Baptist faith. Even though they have some similar moral things, but how they go about their practices are quite different. So it would make it a quite conflicting circumstance. True, people do it every day, and it's not that it's impossible.
Yeah,
but a lot of conversation and a lot of having those tough discussions, especially when children become involved.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly. I think I agree with you that it's easier if you guys have the same core religion, but different ways of demonstrating, like you said, Presbyterian versus Baptist or what have you like that. Mm-hmm. If you have one person's a Buddhist, the other person's a Christian, that might be different, a lot more different. And then that's why, for me, I think it comes down to the level of respect for each person's belief systems.
Yes.
And then even when children are involved, if you have that level of respect, and you talked about the communication piece of it, it's a matter of, not a simple solution, but one solution of allowing the child experiences from both religions and seeing how both religions are, and then making up kind of their own decision of which one they're going to follow. So I do think maybe there's a degree of a parent who says, no, you have to go with mine. But if that parent is wanting the child to go with their religion, I would have to say likely then that means we missed the first piece of the respect part. So if there's a respect there, there's the communication there, I think you could still bring kids into the picture, expose them to both of them, help them see both, and then kind of allow that child to make their own decision. So I think it, again, like ideally, you'd have someone in the same belief system, like we talked about at the beginning. But just to add into that, hey, if you find that you're in that different type of relationship, just understand that there's a level of maturity, there's a level of communication skills, there's a level of respect. There's a whole lot more work and effort that comes into it if it is different religions. But ideally, you end up with someone in the same religion. So that's all I was saying there. Just kind of like both sides of the coin there. So to wrap up the spiritual part of it, it makes life a lot easier when you guys are on one accord.
Right.
And it's about taking the time to get to know the person, listening to what they say, watching what they do, and then giving it enough time to make sure that they're not just going through the motions of it, but that's a core belief that they actually have. That's my takeaway from how spiritual impacts relationships. What about for you?
Yes, I agree with all of that. The proof is in the pudding. Give it enough time, you'll see what the person's made of.
Yeah.
So what do you feel about the mental level in a relationship? Like, where does the person have to be, on their thought processes in a relationship? What do you feel is a good gauge of that?
Yeah, so I think tying it back to from an individual standpoint, I think of the mental is all about that conversation that you're having in your head. So that self-talk. The mental is how you see yourself, and you treat yourself the way you think about yourself. So I think from a relationship standpoint, right, people treat others the way they think of themselves. So it's very important to have a good, healthy self-view of, not like in a narcissistic way, but just having grace for yourself and understanding that you are the best version of you, and every day you try to be better, but there's nobody on earth like you. Not to sound cliche or cheesy, but the reality is there's nobody on earth exactly like you with the experiences you have and everything else. So just being able to celebrate what you have and what you bring to the table, but then as you are in a relationship, you have to again, it's about conversation, questions, and talking, but just listen to how that person talks about themselves and as well as others too. But like the mental piece of it is, as a man thinketh, so is he, right? So, and then they talk about the stuff they think about. So in relationships, if a person is not thinking about themselves highly, and when I say highly, again, it's not like that they're better than other people, but if they don't have a healthy self-esteem about themselves, then I think it reflects in how they treat you, because they don't feel so great about themselves, so they may not be the best relationship partner to be with. Sometimes, not in every case, but sometimes that can be demonstrated or reflected in an abusive relationship, right? So they don't feel so great about themselves, so they're going to manipulate you, or they're going to, treat you badly, talk about you badly, call you out of your name, do all these things to you, and it's really a reflection of how they don't feel so great about themselves. So, what are they putting in their minds? What do they do to stimulate themselves mentally? So are they reading books? Are they listening to podcasts? Things like that, I think, is another thing that's important, because that's, again, what goes in comes out. So if they're putting healthy things into their mind, if they're reading healthy stuff, if they're reading their Bible from the spiritual component of it, then those are things that are going to help them think of themselves in the right way, and then also are going to help them think of you the right way. So, and the last point I'll make is just that, as we talked about from the spiritual perspective, and this is what really sums up the 10 commandments, right? So love God completely, and then love your neighbor as you love yourself, right? So spiritual perspective, if you have that right relationship and you love God completely, and then you thinking of yourself and him, then you'll love yourself correctly, and then you'll love your neighbor as you love yourself. So it really all ties in together. Like how you think about yourself ties into that. So I'll stop there. You tell me, what are your thoughts?
For a person's mentality, I used to have a hard rule where if you were not at the equal education level of me, we might not be able to get along. And I've kind of bent on that. I'm not quite as hard on it as I have been in previous thoughts.
Okay.
As long as that person has enough life experience that I feel that they could still be a person who could stimulate me mentally, and that I could be able to engage with on a mental level and still feel like we can follow each other. Right. I feel like if you can't engage with me in a mental space, being able to connect with me on an emotional and physical space and spiritual space is just not going to happen, because the way I communicate with you is the way I think about stuff. And if we're not able to kind of at least debate or discuss and engage in conversations that are impactful for both of us without it becoming too one-sided or getting your feelings, or it's just a matter of having an adult conversation about things. If that person is not able to do that, then 9 times out of 10, you're not the right person for me. Because that's a lot of relationships, is talking through stuff and making decisions and having to do it. And if that's not something you want to do, or you don't care to do, or the way I go about it and the way you go about it have a lot of conflict where we keep bumping heads, that's probably an indicator that this relationship may not be best. So I definitely feel that the guys that I did date prior tended to be other college educated guys, or at least wanted to go to college, had spent some type of time educating themselves beyond just their high school education, whether in formal ways or informal ways. But they definitely were about elevating their minds and wanting to learn and to discover and to engage in those types of dialogues to make themselves better.
Yeah. Like you said, developing yourself, like that desire to do that. Yes. To increase your intelligence or your awareness and your depth.
Yeah, because I don't like dumb guys. If you're not the brightest bulb, we're probably not going to make it, because I'm going to feel like I'm always having to teach you
what
things.
If he, like, fine?
No, fine and dumb is a terrible combination.
It depends on how fine he is. I might can put over the dumb for a little bit, depending on how fine the brother is. I'm just saying.
No, because fine we say, but dumb is permanent.
I'm just listen. I just gotta educate him. That's all, and he's pretty to look at while I educate him. That's all. I mean,
if you got some processes that are, that he's willing to kind of bring up to get to that point, okay. But if he's like, I'm dumb, I like being dumb, I ain't trying to be nothing but dumb, girl, walk away.
Once again, it depends on how fine the brother is.
There was a time I would have been that person. I can't say it now, but yes, I cannot say I haven't been that way. But
how old you are too has to play a factor into this, right? So and you in your 30s like me, like mid-30s, I probably can't really spend too much time with a brother that's fine but don't got nothing going on in his head. But if you like young, your 20s and stuff, like, why not?
I mean, it's all about how you go into in the relationship. Is this something more serious or it's not? If it is more serious, you may put more weight into that. If it's not as serious and you just enjoy their company from time to time and you get to know them and hang out, that's okay if they're not the brightest bulb at that point. But yeah, it depends on how you engage. What's your intentions?
Exactly. That's all it boils down to.
I agree.
But you're right. For a really meaningful long-term relationship, because fine does not stay fine forever. Things start to, not look the same. As time goes on, you probably would want somebody that mentally, like you said, that's something that you can continue to expand and grow and learn more and allow the relationship to be deeply rooted in something beyond just the looks on the outside. So that's important. And I used to think that, like, as far as the college education part too, and that is, I do still consider that a standard of sort, where you kind of have to be, you know, like you said, either life skills. So that means if you didn't go to college, then do you have your own business, or did you have like a lot of work? Like just
when you're in the military,
have the equivalent of all of the work and effort that I put through in going to college on your side of it. And then also the exposure, like, right. So you're in the military, so you have exposures and things like that, so that we're on the same playing field mentally. And then maturity level wise, I think goes into that too. So if you're able to think at a higher level, likely that means your maturity level is at a higher level as well.
Yes,
so
it does come down to maturity. Yes, I agree. Because sometimes, it may not be the brightest person. Like, I'm not saying you need to, date Einstein, but at least be able to have a conversation where we both can get something from it. That's the baseline of it all.
That's the key. Exactly. That's the key.
This is the conclusion of part 1 of our episode, where we discuss the first 2 principles of self-discovery within relationships. Please tune in again for the second half of our conversation. Thank you for listening to Truth, Lies, and Consequences podcast.